Shelby, you're on camera. And we're on deck. So on deck we have prep test 80, section 1, question number 3. Which one of the following most accurately expresses the overall conclusion drawn in the argument? Okay. The conclusion is the thing that is being explained. The explaining is the reasoning. So let's see what the thing is that's being explained. I just have one slash mark here after the word faithfulness. Whether or not one can rightfully call a person's faithfulness a virtue depends in part on the object of that person's faithfulness. Okay, I don't think they're writing to be friendly here. So let's stop and nail this down. It sounds like a statement that has to be explained. And if it's a statement that has to be explained, it is a conclusion. There may be a subordinate conclusion, very unlikely here, but, because I'd be saying why. Whether or not one can rightfully call a person's faithfulness a virtue. So you say to me, you're faithful. And I say, well, I can't call that a virtue right away because it depends in part on the object of that person's faithfulness. Got it. That's the conclusion. Now they're going to explain why it depends on the object of that faithfulness. And if that's what happens, we just read the conclusion. Next sentence. Virtues are by definition praiseworthy, which is why no one considers resentment virtuous. Even though it is in fact a kind of faithfulness to hatreds or animosities. So the second sentence introduces an example where you can be faithful to something and it clearly is not virtuous, and therefore it depends on what you are being faithful to before you can call the thing virtuous. So the answer is they may reword that first sentence, but that first sentence is the conclusion, which is that whether or not you can rightfully call a person's faithfulness a virtue depends on what are you being faithful to. Okay, so I'm just looking for those words. A, the object of a person's faithfulness partially determines whether or not that faithfulness is virtuous. And that is what the first sentence said. It says in the conclusion of the first sentence, it says depends in part. In the answer choice, it says partly, right? So A, the object of a person's faithfulness partially determines whether or not that faithfulness is virtuous. Because if you're being faithful to being stubborn, it's not going to be virtuous. If you're being faithful to being a loving person, that will be virtuous. So it depends on what you're being faithful to. A is the answer. Good night, lights out. What does B say? B says, virtuous behavior is praiseworthy by definition. Well, that is a fact that's in the reasoning to set the stage to explain the rest of the reasoning. C, behavior that emerges from hatred or animosity cannot be called virtuous. Okay, yes, and that's part of the reasoning. That's why, because of that, it depends, what are you being faithful to? D, faithfulness and resentment are obviously different despite some similarities. Faithfulness and resentment are obviously different despite some similarities. Maybe yes, maybe no, but that's certainly not the conclusion of this argument. The conclusion of this argument is, for me to be able to tell you whether your faithfulness is virtuous, I need to figure out what you're being faithful to. E, resentment should not be considered a virtuous emotion. Well, I agree with that, and because it ought not to be considered a virtuous emotion, it matters what you're being faithful to. So the answer there is A for Augustus.